So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second talk in the Geology lecture series in 2013-14. And if you notice, there are some nice little blue forms out front. It has the third talk, which is the classic Cascadia earthquake talk, 9th anniversary of bringing someone in to talk about lectures on the anniversary or near the anniversary this year of the last great event on January 26, 1700. So it should be a really good talk. Dr. Gavin Hayes, IRIS SSA distinguished speaker that's coming to town. Also out front, the new and improved, because nobody wanted to give me their full birth date, and apparently some of you are afraid to give me just your birth year. All I'm asking for is name, your city or town, state if it's not Oregon, because I get confused easily, and your birth year. It just helps me keep track of some demographics. And by signing in, there's a number of the folks that do the Distinguished Speaker Series. They would really like to have 200 people here. Having your names down actually helps me guarantee that it's a justification, not just me saying, oh yeah, there's 672 people here tonight. So if anybody tells me that, I can actually use that as documentation in the future. But anyway, thank you all for coming out tonight. Also notice a few years ago, last year actually, we started a donation thing. So we've been having some really generous folks contribute. My original goal was to have this completely free and not even ask for anything. Some days you just have to. So if you've got the capacity and are looking for a nonprofit and keeping these things going and have the capacity to do that, it's greatly appreciated. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening because most of the folks that come here to Coos Bay, I actually don't know until they arrive here. And so it's really nice to actually have somebody that agreed to come down and speak that I actually have known for a number of years through a couple of different organizations in the Pacific Northwest, and that's Pat Pringle. Pat began his academic career in the Midwest in Akron, and before he got into teaching, spent a number of years at the USGS working for the Cascade Volcano Observatory. How many of you have ever picked up or gone to Mount St. Helens? Let's start with there. Been to Mount St. Helens? Did you happen to pick up that little booklet about roadside geology of Mount St. Helens? If you didn't, you missed out on a nice little treat. Gives you a great amount of detail. It was written by, Pat Pringle. If you go up there, it's definitely worth it. Also, if you're planning to go up to Mount Rainier, these two, amongst many publications that Pat's affiliated with, probably roadside geology at St. Helens, roadside geology at Mount Rainier are the most widespread. So if you're going up there, it definitely is worth picking up, gives you a lot of insight and a lot of information. Pat's, after working for USGS, went on to the Washington DNR, their state survey, and a few years back went to Centralia College and started an academic career teaching at a community college. So knowing Pat over the years, the students at Centralia are very fortunate. If you have an electronic device, if you wouldn't mind turning it off now, that would be fantastic. Sorry, I should have done that before the intro, sir. But it's my pleasure to introduce to you this evening Pat Pringle.
Thank you very much, Ron. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Isn't there anything going on tonight in Coos Bay? It's Saturday night? It's Saturday night. And so I'm going to do my best. And thank you all for supporting this college also. This college has a vital role in this community, and I think it's just an awesome thing to be supporting our community college system. You see lives change in the community college system, so we're all part of it, and thank you for supporting it. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about buried trees as one of my main focuses, and this came about back in 1982. I started working at the Cascade Volcano Observatory at Mount St. Helens, which is the U.S. Geological Survey's research office in Vancouver that was set up. It was actually patterned after the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory, which was the first internationally acclaimed volcano observatory that was set up on the island of Hawaii after a big tragedy in 1902 in which 29,000 people died on the island of Martinique when a volcano erupted just 7 kilometers away and killed 29,000 people. So enterprising geologist named Thomas Jagger decided he wanted to start this volcano observatory because he wanted to understand volcanoes. So I was lucky enough to get employed there at the USGS in 1982, and I soon found myself on the volcanic hazards team, and not just studying Mount St. Helens, but also studying Mount Hood and Mount Rainier. And so when I started working at Mount Hood, I started finding these buried trees. And we knew that you could get a radiocarbon date on the tree, which is a way to test the isotopes in the wood to find out how long ago it died. But the radiocarbon dates, give you kind of a fuzzy answer. They put you in the ballpark, but they don't give you a really tight answer. And when we started finding out that some of the trees died only a couple centuries ago, and we found out, we also saw some really interesting and intriguing eyewitness accounts of some of the rivers around there by Lewis and Clark that indicated they may have actually witnessed the after effects of this eruption. So that led me into wanting to look at the tree rings to find out exactly what year those trees died. And so that's kind of, I'm still working on that 30 years later, all kinds of things related to that. So that's what I'm going to share with you tonight. So working at Mount St. Helens is like being at a natural laboratory, and that's why at Mount St. Helens, looking at all the deposits right after the eruption, we began to become familiar with some of these different deposits, which is the sediment left behind when one of these volcanic events, like a volcanic mud flow or a hot flow of ash and hot rocks, leaves a certain discrete layer behind. Those are called deposits. And what we wanted to do was go look at some of the other Cascade volcanoes and see if we could identify those kind of deposits on the other volcanoes to build a history of those other volcanoes and their past eruptions. So that was one of the things we decided to do. And then in the meantime, we also got to look at some very fascinating things, like in this picture on the right here. This is a time lapse taken by, and I'm actually in an airplane here flying around the crater rim at about 3 or 4 in the morning, and was watching this very rock fall that this guy was taking a picture of. So I mean, this is the kind of stuff we actually were able to do back then, and it was, you felt a lot like an astronaut, I'll tell you. But one of the reasons it's really important to get the past history on all these events, volcanoes, landslides, earthquakes, is that we have a fairly limited history of those kind of events here in the Northwest. Our written history really only goes back a couple centuries, if you think about it. In fact, the painting on your left is the first kind of realistic rendition of Mount St. Helens ever done, and it was done by a painter named Paul Kane, who was part of a Hudson's Bay Company expedition in 1847. And this is really an accurate painting of Mount St. Helens in eruption in the 1800s from up near Toledo, Washington. And so if you want to go back much farther than that, you have to look into that record of sediments around each volcano to start piecing these stories together. See if I can remember these directions now. So, okay, so I'm going to give you a snapshot tour. First, a little introduction about the geology, which I'm sure a number of you know about this already, but we'll just look at it again. Why do we have buried trees in the Northwest? And for that matter, why is petrified wood the state gem of Washington State? Well, we have a lot of geologic calamities that bury forests over geologic time. So that's why we have buried trees, submerged trees, petrified wood in the geologic record from way back, and so on. And I'll talk about some of the coastal forests that are what we call subfossil trees. Subfossil trees are still wood, but they're buried. They're actually a type of fossil. And they're preserved because they're preserved without, where there's very little oxygen to decompose them. I'll talk about some of the ones at Mount Hood that I just mentioned, and some at Mount Rainier that record past eruptions. And I'll talk about the Bonneville landslide, which is a really interesting landslide in the Columbia Gorge that happened about 550 years ago, and it dammed the entire Columbia River, possibly for a fairly long time. And it gives rise to some interesting legends. And then I'll talk a little bit, too, about the Tacoma Fault and also about the history of tree ring research in Washington and Oregon. So to begin with, again, many of you are probably familiar with this, or should be, that Washington and Oregon and Northern California, in fact, the whole West Coast, is an active geological place. We're in a place here in the Cascadia subduction zone, which is a place, boy, this pointer is kind of faint. Let me see if it's a little bit brighter. So we have a big fault off here that goes from about Mendocino, California, up to the middle of Vancouver Island. And it's the same, it's a mirror image of that fault that ruptured over in Japan in 2011 and caused the big tsunami. And it's very similar to the fault that ruptured in Indonesia in 2004 to cause that big tsunami. So we have that same kind of fault there. We have a collision going on, and these red dots are all earthquakes that are taking place in the ocean, what we call the Pacific Plate and the Juan de Fuca Plate, the oceanic seafloor out here, which is sliding underneath this like this. This is called subduction. And because of that, we have episodic earthquakes every few centuries. We have a record of some of these that we'll talk about. We have a record of historic earthquakes, but again, we don't have a record that goes back very far. So are there other ways to figure out what's going on? But it's because of these things, it's because of this collision, this convergence of these giant plates of the Earth that we actually have things like earthquakes and that we actually have buried forests and volcanoes. So, the whole science of understanding how the planet works really is pretty young when you think about it. I mean, the word plate tectonics, the outer rigid parts of the Earth, the 100-kilometer thick plates, we call the tectonic plates that move around. There's about 13 or 14 really big plates that interact and a whole bunch of tiny ones too. But we didn't even know about this really in terms of officially recognizing it in science until the mid-1960s. In fact, the phrase plate tectonics was invented in 1967, the year before I started college. So and we've kept learning after that too. We continue to learn about what plate tectonics really means. For example, in the 1980s, it was discovered, paleontologists started finding all these weird fossils, and all these different colored blobs of rock shown on the right here are different geologic rock units that are separated by faults, and they may not have anything to do with the bodies of rock next to them. And so the scientists who were studying the fossils, the paleontologists, were finding fossils that they'd normally find over in Asia, and they couldn't figure out, what are they doing here? We're finding fossils from southern latitudes in faraway places. Well, they didn't know how they got there because they didn't really understand how all these different bodies of rock came to be in this one place to begin with. And then finally, in the 1980s and shortly after that, some people published papers and they realized, oh, these are exotic slices of rock that are being carried on tectonic plates, and they're being carried from somewhere else, and they're literally attached or accreted onto the margin of the North American continent at various times in the past during what we call mountain building episodes. So we didn't even learn that until the 1980s, that was going on. And now we know that most of Alaska, much of British Columbia, of course, most of northern Washington, and places like the Wallowa and Blue Mountains and the eastern Klamaths and Siskiyous, all of those are exotic rock packages. Some of them came from close nearby places, some came from very, very far away places. And they've all arrived by being little passengers on these tectonic plates moving around. Well, that kind of history is what puts together the geology of a place like Oregon. And that kind of tectonic history also is accomplished by earthquake faults, volcanoes, and other kinds of cataclysmic geologic events that take place a lot more often than we think, because in our short human lifetime, we just don't see that many of them. And so today, it's not just a collision between the Pacific Plate, or between, I should say, the Juan de Fuca Plate and the Little Gorda Plate here subducting or sinking underneath North America. It's kind of a little bit more complicated than that. There's also kind of a crush from the southeast going on, because the whole Pacific Plate here is also moving to the northwest. And so as it is, it's kind of coupled with California. It's been pulling apart the Great Basin and Range. When you look at that topographic map of Nevada and you see all those little crenulations in there, that whole thing is being ripped apart in the last 15 million years. So geologists call this mega shear, meaning it's over a huge area and it's kind of a shearing or sideways motion. And so we've got fault zones coming up through Oregon, what we think may be some kind of a zone of shear coming up through Washington State. And what it's doing is, these are the GPS velocity vectors for actual movement during a year of Washington and Oregon. Here's the index. This is 1 centimeter. That each inch is about 2.5 centimeters, right? So that's about 1/3 of an inch movement in a year right there. A lot of these are much longer than that. So you can see that we are actually moving every year. What's going on? Why are we having all this movement? Well, one thing, the Pacific plate's moving north. Notice that a lot of them are actually pointed north, so there's like a northward compression going on. And that's causing the crust of the Earth to shorten over time. And so, so really it's a combination of all these things that's literally straining the Earth around us. Some of this is going to lead to future earthquakes because rocks can only handle being squeezed so long before they're mechanically just unable to hold that squeezing, right? And then they're going to break. So we are living certainly in an active place. And some things that provide clues that we've had earthquakes in the past if you see the maroon and red dots all over the place, those are places where we have giant rock slides and debris avalanches, big landslides that have either buried trees or dammed up little streams to form lakes, and all the trees that were growing next to the stream are now at the bottom of the lake, so they're now subfossil trees. They're all drowned trees in these lakes. So we have a number of lakes, well over 25 lakes, probably as many as 30 or 40 around the Northwest with submerged forests in them. And they are recording, those trees are recording the date of that big earthquake or whatever it was that caused that big rock slide or landslide. And you'll notice that some of these are faults, these fuchsia-colored lines. And here's the Seattle Fault, here's the Tacoma Fault, I'll talk about that. Here's the one running through Olympia. Some of the geologists call it the legislature's fault, which I think is, it's not exactly good framing on that one, but here's the St. Helens zone right here, which is a really active fault zone that goes right through Mount St. Helens. And you can see there's plenty of them in Oregon too. Down here in Columbia, this is the Columbia River right here. Now the yellow trees are trees that are drowned by subsidence when earthquakes actually lower the ground. So you see the yellow trees on the coast here, and I'll talk about these. These were killed by great earthquakes in the past along the coast. You'll see some trees in Puget Sound drowned, and we think now that actually parts of Puget Sound have dropped during giant earthquakes in the past. And then all the little yellow trees here in the gorge, these are part of this drowned forest of the Columbia that was killed by the Bonneville landslide, and I'll talk about that too. And then the ones in blue here and turquoise, those are trees killed by volcanism, by volcanic activity. Okay, just showing a fault zone, fault map of Oregon too. And some of these are really old faults, maybe inactive, the black ones, but the red ones may have been active in the last 10,000 years. And geologically speaking, 10,000 years puts them on the radar screen for something we're really interested in. Also, we don't know where all the faults are that have ruptured in the last 10,000 years. We just simply don't know. All that dirt and vegetation covers up the geology sometimes. So here's a drowned forest, drowned in Spider Lake on the Olympic Peninsula. You can't see the landslide because it's under all these trees here. But we got a radiocarbon date on these trees, and they're 1,100 years old. So they're over 1,000 years old, and they're preserved because they're in this lake. The reason they're sticking out of the lake now in this picture, which was taken in 1992, is that we had a really bad drought then. And so the water table had gone down and the lake had gone down, thus exposing these trees, these subfossil, we call these subfossil trees. But I'm going to go back. I'm still interested in going back and getting more of these trees, so I can look at the tree rings. Now I'm going to show you a little video that my students made, and I'm not sure exactly how I can turn this on, and I'm wondering if, because I don't really have control of the computer here, and I don't see anybody. Can you turn it on upstairs? Please? Thank you. Forget my etiquette, every once in a while. So, cross your fingers. This was the first movie this student ever made. It's really amazing.
Hi, I'm Laura. This year I got to be involved in a project studying tree rings. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. First, we went to 2 different locations to collect core samples. We used a delicate, precise instrument called an increment bore. First, we drilled straight into the center of the tree. Then we removed the core sample.
I'm going to again use this as a dipstick. and we're going to slide it in like this, and it shouldn't go too much farther. That's it. It stops. So it's going into the core.
Once the samples were removed, we had to pull the increment bore back out of the tree. It wasn't always an easy proposition. We collected samples from several different trees, and all the students got a chance to participate. We took our precious core samples back to the lab to prepare and study them. The first step was to remove them from the plastic straws in which we had stored them. The cores had become twisted, so to study them properly we had to untwist them by steaming them over beakers of boiling water. Once we had successfully untwisted the cores, then we could mount them onto blocks of wood using wood glue. Then we sanded them down until they were smooth and flat on top. This made them easier to see, study, and handle. Now we could study the cores. We inspected the sizes of the tree rings, since the sizes of tree rings reveal things about past climates. We marked the narrowest tree rings on graphs. Then we used a computer program called ImageJ to precisely measure the tree rings. Finally, we could compare the data and discover trends, like the peak in tree ring width in 1998. It's incredible what we can learn from tree rings. The entire project was a valuable learning experience.
First go!
Not bad for the first video. She got an A. No punctuation needed except in the credits. All right. So a little introduction to tree rings anyway. And she said the right words there. Tree rings tell us something about past climate. That's exactly what we want to do, is find out about the past climate. But also for geology, we want to find out when that tree died, if we can. And we can't always do that. So where did the science of tree rings really get going? Well, a guy named Andrew Douglas was an astronomer who was trying to figure out if he could measure some fluctuations in the sun's energy through time. So he started studying tree rings. Before you know it, he'd practically forgotten about the sun, and he focused his entire life on tree rings, and he founded the first tree ring lab at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And it's still one of the most famous labs today. And what he first started to do was a thing called cross-dating, which meant he could find old tree. If he had a living tree that had a good tree ring record, he could actually go back and look at older and older trees and match those ring patterns to date even trees that had died at some time in the past. And one of his first big achievements doing that came in 1921 when some archaeologists and anthropologists brought him some timbers from the Anasazi ruins in the American Southwest, and he was finally able to reach out with the tree rings and date them to sometime in the 12th century or the 1200s. I don't know the exact date, but I know that happened in 1929, and that was a huge achievement back then, to be able to give the exact year when those adobe structures were built because of being able to date the timbers in the structures. So in the Northwest, we use narrow rings, but we also use light rings, or really faint rings, and here's some of the rings here, and I'll talk about the significance of those. On the top you see a photograph, a photomicrograph we call it, of wood from Cougar Rock Campground at Mount Rainier, and you can see that the year 1601, Shakespeare was alive and writing in 1601. You see that year 1601 is a really faint, here in a normal tree ring, here's the beginning of the growth season, right? And during the summer, the tree is producing wood, and then in the midsummer, when it's kind of getting dry, tree goes through a metabolic change and starts producing really dense cells. And then in about September, October, this happens to be a Douglas fir, about September or October, it kind of shuts down and goes dormant for the year, at least in terms of producing that year's tree ring. So it's really telling us about the summer's growth, but also the rain and the environment from the previous year also plays a role in how much fuel that tree's going to have. But you see that the 1601 ring doesn't really have this dark wood, which we call late wood. It's very faint, so we call that a light ring. Well, what that means is it was really a cold summer. So that's what you find all over the world at upper latitude trees, like the farther north you go, or in high elevations. You find these faint rings. You can go out and look for these today. Well, it turns out some dendrochronologists, tree ring scientists, were trying to see if they could use tree rings to figure out the actual global temperature over the last 1,000 years. So here's what they did in Nature Science magazine in 1998. They have a paper, and it shows the last 600 years, starting at 1400 AD on the bottom and going up to about the year 2000. And what they did was they plotted the low-density rings, like 1601, are these little yellow spikes coming down. So those are all the really cold summers in trees all over the northern hemisphere. Notice 1601 here. It is the coldest summer in the last 600 years. Well, then they started noticing something really interesting. The really cold years were years when we had really huge volcanic eruptions from really explosive volcanoes that produced a lot of sulfur. And here's Pinatubo erupting in the Philippines. That was a volcano that was 10 times the size of Mount St. Helens in terms of the total amount of ash produced. Plus, it produced a huge, huge amount of sulfur dioxide. Well, that sulfur dioxide forms sulfuric acid droplets in the atmosphere, and that reflects the solar energy back into space and cools the Earth off. And so you can see there's a relationship between these big explosive eruptions and these really cold summers. So here's 1816, which was known as the year without a summer in Europe. And this is famous because Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein that summer because they were hanging out at a Swiss lake and it was so miserable they had a contest to write the world's worst horror story. And so really her creative juices were flowing because of the miserable conditions that summer caused by this huge volcanic eruption, Tambora, which was over in Sumatra. So there's a lot more you could say about that, but for us those light rings are a tool to actually date trees. If we can find those light rings in dead trees in higher elevations, we can actually date them to the year. So who was one of the main pioneers of tree ring dating in the Northwest? Probably has to be Don Lawrence, who grew up in Portland, Oregon, did his PhD at Johns Hopkins University, and as a kid, his grandparents owned the Lawrence Leather Company. In fact, his grandfather married the daughter of the guy who owned the largest spur company in the world. So they had a really thing going with saddles and spurs. And so he kind of lived a privileged lifestyle, and he spent his summers in the Columbia Gorge at his grandmother's house. And that's where he began to get infatuated with the landscape and the history of the Columbia Gorge. So he was the first one to actually take an interest. In fact, he did his PhD on the forests of the Columbia Gorge. And he took an interest on the Bridge of the Gods legend, for example, which has to do with the Bonneville landslide. And the Bridge of the Gods legend says that the tribes said they could actually walk across the Columbia to get to the other side. And they were walking on the Bonneville landslide at the time because the whole Columbia River was dammed up. So Donald and Elizabeth Lawrence were essentially pioneers in the tree ring world. And I got to go out with Don in the field. He actually reviewed the first paper I ever had published in a science journal, and I also got to go out in the field with him in the mid-'80s when he was almost 90 years old. So Don worked at Mount St. Helens. He tried to estimate the dates of early eruptions at Mount St. Helens. He worked at Mount Hood. And then later on, David Yamaguchi came along at the University of Washington, and he was studying the forests of Mount St. Helens before the eruption. And so when the eruption happened, he had to change his ideas about what he was going to do. And one of the things he decided to do is he's going to start looking for all the berry trees that were now exposed and find out how they got killed and date them. And so he was able to date these past eruptions of Mount St. Helens using tree rings. A huge eruption in 1480, actually now we know it happened in 1479, not 1480. Another big one in 1482, only 2 years later. One about the beginning of the 15th century here, and then another one in 1800. Every one of those eruptions is as big as or bigger than the one in 1980 that we think of as really a huge eruption. So Mount St. Helens is really an active volcano. And so Dave went on to really be a pioneer in tree rings that way. And another advance in the Northwest was the dating of not the dating of the Seattle Fault, but at least identifying different trees that died during the Seattle Fault and finding out by comparing tree rings that those trees at different places both died at the same time. And we knew that happened about 900 AD or so. Now, let me just go back real quick. I'll point out that here's Seattle, here's the Puget Sound in Washington State, here's the Olympic Mountains, and here's the Seattle Fault. It goes right through the city of Seattle. This is a big fault. When it ruptured between 900 AD and 930 AD, it lifted an island up 20 feet at one time. And it caused a tsunami in Puget Sound. And that tsunami actually traveled up Puget Sound, and it left deposits on the southern shore of Whidbey Island, and it left deposits here at West Point. And at West Point, when they were digging the new sewage treatment plant for the city of Seattle, they found one of these buried trees in the tsunami deposit from that fault. And it also caused a bunch of great landslides at the bottom of Lake Washington, which is this body of water here. So a dendrochronologist, a tree ring scientist named Gordon Jacoby, thought he looked at the tree rings of the West Point tree, he measured all the tree rings of the trees at the bottom of Lake Washington, and he found that their signature, their tree rings, were just about exactly the same, and they died the same year. And so it turned out that this was the tree on which they actually got the radiocarbon date between 900 and 930 AD. So we know that the Seattle Fault ruptured between 900 and 930 AD, and that the trees at the bottom of Lake Washington were also died the exact same year. So they were probably swept to the bottom by the big earthquake as well. And one of the next major advances was also Dave Yamaguchi of Mount St. Helens fame again. He worked with Brian Atwater to, see if my other picture comes in here, to study the ghost forest over along the coast of Washington. And this is the ghost forest that he found at Capelles. And what he was looking for was right after the big earthquake in Alaska in 1964, which we call the Good Friday earthquake. That was a magnitude 9.2 earthquake. Again, the same kind as we had in Japan. And that earthquake dropped a whole area of land parallel to the fault zone, many meters, like 1 or 2 meters downward. And so, of course, the trees that were now growing there above the tide level now had their ankles and their legs in the sea during the intertidal zone, in the intertidal zone. So those trees died. And when the geologists saw those dead trees right after the earthquake, they said, you know, I wonder if we could find a drowned forest just like this on the west coast of the United States. It might tell us a little bit about our own history of these giant earthquakes. And sure enough, Brian started canoeing, and he found this ghost forest up along the Capelles. And they were able to radiocarbon date that to about 1700 AD, but then Dave Yamaguchi found out that the tree rings, and this took years because most of these trees, if you have a cedar fence, you know the wasps like to eat the cedar fence. You can even hear them eating it. Well, these trees were missing their outer wood. They actually had to go down and dig out whole tree roots to get the rings that were still there under the bark, right? So they'd know exactly when the trees died. And they showed that it happened, that all the trees, the last ring was 1699. So they knew it happened sometime between the end of the growing season in 1699 and the beginning of the next growing season in 1700 AD. Finally, when the scientists in Japan said, hey, we've got actual written records of tsunamis here in 1700 AD, did they actually come up with the exact date of that earthquake, which was January 26th. And I hope I'm not stealing the story from the next speaker about that. So here's Dave Yamaguchi on the left looking at some of these trees, and he actually does something you probably shouldn't do. He sticks the whole toe of his chainsaw into the tree to, definitely says not to do that on the directions, you know, but scientists are desperate sometimes. They gotta have a sample. I don't do that. And then here's Brian Atwater looking at the deposits of the actual tsunami and then the deposit of the soil that's been lowered into the intertidal zone. These guys spent a lot of time out in the mud to get this record for us. And in some places where we went on field trips, you could see the footprint of different earthquakes. Like here's the 1700 earthquake, here's one that happened around 1100 years ago, and here's a big stump from a big earthquake about 1600 years ago, about 400 AD. And it turns out there are about 13 of these big earthquakes or more since the eruption of Mount Mazama to produce Crater Lake 7,600 years ago. So, and that brings us to some other coastal stumps like the ones at Sunset Bay. And Ron was the one, Ron Metzger was the one that told us about this, that these had a date of about 1,200 years ago. And so I cored a couple of these when we were here for the field conference that Ron hosted last summer. And I'd like to come back someday. This is during a low tide. You can see how many of these trees there are. I'd like to actually look at these tree rings in more detail to see if we can tell anything about when this happened. And here's the stumps up at Neskowen that you may have heard about or maybe may have seen yourselves. These trees, it turns out, died about possibly related to that event that happened around 400 AD, because that radiocarbon date is not very precise. And we don't know where the wood was from because there was no mention of where the bark was on the tree where the guy took the sample. This is in the early 1970s. So these trees really need a lot more study too. Unfortunately, the Oregon State researchers who wanted to study those trees, the citizens there didn't let them study them because they said they were sacred trees. So if they're sacred trees, I'd want to know more about them myself. Okay, well then, here's an interesting story. This has to do with what led us into looking at the Mount Hood buried trees, and that was that when we saw Lewis and Clark's journals and realized that they had named the Sandy River the Quicksand River, and here's their map. This is near Troutdale, Oregon, which is about 20 miles east of Portland, and here's the Columbia River coming down, and in fact, here's the Bonneville landslide, and Lewis and Clark passed by there just a day or so before that. So they stopped here in early November 1805, and they talked about this quicksand river and how there was so much quicksand and they could hardly get by this place. And you could tell they were really curious about it, because when they came back in late March of 1806, they sent somebody 6 miles up this river to look at it again. They were really curious, what's going on here? Well, they knew it drained Mount Hood, but what they didn't know was that Mount Hood was a volcano, and they didn't know anything about volcanic mud flows happening at volcanoes like Mount Hood. So this is what led us to start looking carefully at the tree rings, and what you can see in this picture, all the red dots, are places where we found buried trees at Mount Hood. Now here's the crater of Mount Hood. In this photograph, you can see the crater is right here, and there's a lava dome, it's almost like Mount St. Helens. There's a little lava dome right in the center of the crater. And this volcano was very active in the late 1700s. So we looked at these trees, and when we talk later about the Bonneville landslide, here's the Bonneville landslide. Looks like it's about 15, 16 miles farther upstream from Troutdale than the delta of the Sandy River. So this is a picture of the west side of Mount Hood, and you can see the valley that was where these flows came down in the 1700s. You can see the vegetation is still disturbed. It's still don't have old growth vegetation growing on the soil because it's so dry and so full of pumice and stones that a forest just can't seem to get going there. So it's really interesting. Here you can see where it came down and the mud flow went up into a stream channel and dammed the stream, and there's a lot of ghost snags or stumps sticking up there. So this is where we found a lot of these trees, and we found several even that had scars on them but were still alive. And so we found them all the way down the Sandy River. Here's some exposed in a terrace, and you can see them sticking up out of the terrace. We canoed the whole river a few times to find these trees. This is one of the professors from Akron University. He came out and he wanted to go out in the field with me, so I put him to work. Said, all that homework you gave me, I'm putting you to work now. So here's what we found out at Mount Hood. We started looking at the tree rings, and in one of these trees, we actually found that 1601 ring, and this is one of the dead trees sticking up through the mudflow deposit just west of Mount Hood. So we actually found that really faint 1601 ring in there, and we also noticed that we could find certain really narrow rings, like 1754 always seems to be a really narrow ring, and you can see it in all these trees. So that to us was like a marker, like a benchmark to tell us where we were in the tree rings. And so this particular tree here was one of the buried trees I found. It was buried in the mudflow deposit from the late 1700s, and here's 1781 is the outermost ring of that tree, and then the bark. So we know that tree died at the end of the 1781 growing season. And we found another tree in a totally different river drainage, exact same story. Last ring was 1781. So that and some other news, some other rings that told us some of those trees were injured again around 1800, told us that Mount Hood's eruptions began in 1781 and continued until just a couple of years before Lewis and Clark arrived there. Here's a record of tree ring widths going back into the 1600s, put together by some researchers who were looking at drought levels in the Columbia River Basin. This is from a whole bunch of different tree cores in the Columbia River Basin. So it goes literally from about 1990 all the way back to about 1680 or so AD. And so in this wiggle graph here, the areas where it goes really down, those are really tiny rings that record drought conditions, really dry conditions. If you look at this, you can probably tell me, what was this really dry time between the 1930s and 1940s? What do we call that? The Dust Bowl, right? That's recording the Dust Bowl. So here what we have are these droughts, some of them lasting for 5, 10 years. They're really severe droughts. And if you look at that graph, you realize, we really haven't had one of those since the Dust Bowl in the Columbia River Basin. And yet, they're part of the normal climatic history around here. So that's, in the future of looking at things like dams and fish passage, water for agriculture use, all the water uses that you'd budget out for various purposes, you have to kind of factor in some of these things in the future. And one of the last types of trees we're looking at Mount Hood are these ghost trees. They're trees that are standing dead trees above the timberline zone. And if you've been to Timberline Lodge and looked out to the east across the parking lot of the White River up above Hood Meadow Ski Area, you've seen these ghost forests. They're just standing dead trees. A lot of these are white bark pine trees. They're a lot like bristlecone pines. They're full of pitch, and they last forever when they die. They just stand there. They're kind of freeze-dried at that altitude. So this is a picture by Don Lawrence in 1941 with Ken Phillips, who was a geologist he worked with all the time. And in fact, Ken was also in the field with us that day. He was like 92 when we were out in the field with him, and he was jumping off boulders. And I thought, 92, jumping off boulders, climbing up slopes. I'd like to do that when I'm 92. So, but it turns out that at Mount Hood, we found not only the ghost trees, but right over there also we found trees buried in dunes, trees buried in lahar deposits, and also trees buried in pyroclastic flows, these hot ashy deposits, and you can see these trees are even charred. So we've got our work ahead of us to figure out what's going on that side of the mountain, because here we have 4 different kinds of subfossil trees to deal with. And then here's one of these ghost trees. This one is actually just above Timberline Lodge. So the first radiocarbon dates we have in these indicates, yes, they did die about 200 years ago, but the tree rings are really inscrutable and hard to figure out. Well, let's jump up to Mount Rainier, which has been proclaimed, one of the most dangerous volcanoes in the world, and certainly the most dangerous in North America, because it has a cubic mile of snow and ice on it, and it's an active volcano. So Mount Rainier has been elected as a so-called decade volcano in the last couple decades. The decade of the 1990s was the International Decade of Natural Disaster Reduction, and so Mount Rainier was one of the top 15 volcanoes worldwide that was chosen for more study. And so here's some buried forests at Mount Rainier, and notice they go all the way down the valleys. Here's Mount Rainier here, and these buried trees, you can follow them all the way down to Puget Sound, because those ancient mud flows, those volcanic mud flows from Mount Rainier went that far. They went all the way from the mountain, which is 14,400 feet tall, down to the Puget Sound at sea level. In fact, not only did those mud flows go down there, here is a reconstruction of the map of Tacoma and Seattle area and the Puget Sound 5,600 years ago, before one of the largest volcanic mud flows the world has ever seen. It's what's called the Osceola mud flow from Mount Rainier. Now this mud flow was, you may have remembered if you studied Mount St. Helens, that the whole summit of Mount St. Helens collapsed and formed a big landslide in 1980, right? Well, that landslide traveled about 15 miles and then it stopped. When Mount Rainier erupted 5,600 years ago, the entire summit detached, but it was so mushy and rotten that instead of just coming to a stop, it kept going, and it went all the way into Puget Sound, 4 cubic kilometers. So it was actually substantially larger than the mud flow from the landslide from the summit of Mount St. Helens. So, and after that big mud flow, which is this brown pattern over here on the left, you can see that the valley filled in all the way. This is 20 miles. Here's the old shoreline, 5,600 years ago. Now you could walk literally 20 miles on solid land. The entire fjord has been filled in by Mount Rainier eruptions that have happened since that time. And from the port of Tacoma, you used to be able to paddle all the way up to Puyallup. That's about 8 miles. So it's really filled in a huge amount. So that just tells you how consequential the sediment is that comes off these volcanoes. And what told us about all this? Well, the holes, the well logs from the people drilling wells in the valley bottom, geotechnical wells, which engineering geologists drill so they can see how stable the soil is underneath there for when they build bridges and so on. All these things tell us that the mud flows are down there. And then, of course, the buried trees, which are also there. So I've got students working right now on these buried trees and these buried trees because there are also some interesting tribal legends. I've got a student who's half Native American. She's working on those trees because there are also some tribal histories that may record these same trees being buried, and they're over 1,000 years old. And I just think it would really be neat to date a legend that's over 1,000 years old and find out that oral history has carried that long in their culture. That's pretty remarkable. Well, then there are some other more recent oral histories. Here's the one that's also recorded in Ballard's book. Arthur Ballard was a noteworthy person who interviewed the tribes when he first came here. And Ella E. Clark, who wrote, you may have seen her book on sale at national parks called Indian Legends of the Pacific Northwest. Ella Clark taught English at Washington State University, and she knew Arthur Ballard. I went over and looked at all her files that are still in the archives over there, and they had a number of letters back and forth from each other. So they compared notes on these stories, and they sometimes interviewed the same tribal members and compared the stories. You could probably see them together. Just see if they told you the same thing they told me, you know. So this story, and the narrator telling the story says, this is not a myth. The head of Taco Bed, now Taco Bed is Mount Rainier, also known as Tacoma or Tacoma. Taco Bed burst open and the water rushed down the hillsides and swept the trees from the valley. The prairie about the town of Ording, that means the flat area near this town of Ording, was called by us SWOCC, which means open, because the flood cleaned it and left it covered with porous stone. So one of the things that was interesting here is this is talking about a big mud flow that buried this town of Ording, which is about 35 miles downstream of Mount Rainier. And when you go to Ording today, they've been putting in some new homes, they've been building new schools, and when they do, every time they dig a hole, you look down in the hole, there's a giant buried tree down there. And so this one on the left, I took this picture in 1993, and we found that this, using radiocarbon dating and tree rings, this probably died about 1502 AD or 1503 AD, so a little over 500 years ago is when that happened. And so that oral history actually has stayed in their culture 500 years. I think that's truly interesting. Gary is the name of this, it was the guy running the excavator on the left. He was a bit upset because he couldn't get it out. They had to bring in a crane the next day and pull it out of there. So, and I was quite happy because that photo got published in Science News a few years ago. But you can see, I'll just go back real quickly, you can see where Mount Rainier is today, 35 miles away, and you know, anything coming off that west side again, because the crater on top is full, it could go in any direction, is going to come down and go right through here again. So here's some of those, more of those trees in Ording on the left. Rosalie Lamb was in high school when her mother called me and said that she was really interested in a science project, so we arranged a thing with her science teacher to have her come work with me, and she began coring trees and measuring trees, and then a few years later she went off to Brown University, she got a degree in geology, and then she went to MIT and got a master's in geology, and then she ended up, she's now a high school teacher in Maine. So her early work in tree rings, though, I still remember. She's the one that when I was looking over her shoulder trying to help her measure stuff, she said, "Pat, I think I hear your phone ringing." "I hear you, Rosalie. I hear you. Bye." She knew what was going on. She didn't need any instruction from me. So here's even more buried trees. These are trees that died a little over 1,000 years ago down near Emerald Downs Racetrack. When we found these trees, we had no idea that any of these mud flows from Mount Rainier came down here 1,100 years ago. No record had ever been found. So the value of these trees is that high up on the mountain, trees might rot, but down in the valley where they're below the floodplain and they're kept moist all the time, those trees are like time capsules, you know, they're recording these ancient events. And it's kind of ironic that development is what's exposing the trees. So here we are talking about the potential hazards of future eruption, but we're also excited when somebody digs up a buried tree. Maybe not so excited because they're going to build, you know, a new school that's right in the middle of the volcanic hazard zone. And then, so that was 1995 when these stumps were dug up. And then just the next year, Brian Atwater of the USGS called me. He was looking at an intertidal mud down here at the Port of Seattle that he thought had been lifted above he was trying to see how far the Seattle Fault lifted up in all the different places along the edge of the Seattle Fault. But when he got to this Seattle Fault, he found, well, there's Mount Rainier sand on top of it. So he got me down there, and we found some wood in there and dated it at 1,200 years old. We think it's the exact same mud flow here, you know, quite a few miles upstream. And the other cool thing that we found was there were worm burrows in the bottom of this sand. And Liz Nesbitt, who's the paleontologist at the Burke Museum, told us that, oh, that means that the mud flow came down before the Seattle Fault ruptured and lifted this whole area up, because those were shrimp burrows, not worm burrows. So those shrimp had to be alive, and they had to be in the intertidal zone when the actual earthquake happened, which means that the mud flow came down first and buried the site, and then eventually the Seattle Fault ruptured. So maybe that goes back to some of the oral histories when they actually say that was the day the world changed. You know, because their world changed. Their local world changed in a big way. That same year, 1996, even more buried trees were dug up. And we thought, oh, say, more of those 1,000-year-old trees. Oh, no. These died about 500 AD. They're also covered by Mount Rainier pumice and ash, and we had no idea that any eruptions from Mount Rainier had even happened at that time either. And about a year later, a researcher who was working up at Mount Rainier said, Pat, I found it. I found the ash layer that goes with that big mud flow down there. So it's like these records are just slowly, you know, making themselves available. But that's one of the problems of studying volcanoes, is that volcanoes erode away part of their history, and they also bury part of their history. So you have to look for it. And it takes a long time. That's why I'm still working on this stuff 3 decades after I started some of these projects. But the net result of that, and the net positive information here, is that you can, when you find these layers, you can build a map that characterizes where they went to. And not only do you have the information on where the bad areas, where the potentially risky areas in the future, you know where the safe places are too. And that, to me, is some of the best information that you can have. You know where you can go to get out of harm's way. But yes, mud flows can go all the way from the summit of Mount Rainier down into the Puget Sound. And so when Jim Valance, who's the geologist working on the ash layers, he looked at all the ash layers at Mount Rainier. Don Molyneux, who had worked at Mount St. Helens, found about 11 major eruptive periods at Mount Rainier when he worked there in the 60s, but he knew there were all kinds of little ash layers he couldn't make sense of. So he told Jim, he said, hey, when you're up there, really look at these little ash layers and try and map them out. So Jim did just that. Instead of 11 eruptions, he's got 40 eruptions in the last 10,000 years at Mount Rainier. So Mount Rainier is indeed a very active volcano. And again, it's got 1 cubic mile of snow and ice on it. So that's snow and ice that can melt, you know, and form some of these giant mud flows. So back to this interesting Bridge of the Gods legend in the Columbia Gorge. Lewis and Clark, just a few days before they got down to Troutdale, east of Oregon, to describe the Quicksand River, they were up, they had just passed what's now the town of Dalles in the Columbia River, and they began seeing these pine trees. And in their journal they said, most singular are the stumps of pine trees scattered some distance in the river, which has the appearance of being dammed below and forced to encroach upon the shore. In other words, they were interpreting these trees probably were drowned by this landform that seems to have dammed the river down below at one time. They also came up with other hypotheses, other guesses about how exactly the trees drowned. They said, you know, do you think they slid down in the river? No, that doesn't seem right. And finally, when they got down to the Bonneville landslide, they realized no, and they were also talking with the tribes down there too. They camped out there for 2 days before they went through the rapids. And the tribe, between them talking to the tribes and making the observations of this big landslide, which you can see goes all, it's still covered with vegetation, but it goes all the way across the river here. And then here are some of these dead trees. This is a painting by Paul Kane, the same guy who did that Mount St. Helens painting. And he painted this just probably a few weeks before he painted the painting of Mount St. Helens. So he's the first person also to paint the Bonneville landslide. So here's an aerial view of the landslide on the left. And it came from a big chunk of Columbia River basalt. There are like 11 big lava flows up here, and they collapsed and ran out. Now, at one time, they would have dammed the entire river. Here's the Bonneville Dam. Here's the second powerhouse. Here's the first part of the dam right here. This second one was built in 1978, and when they built it, they found a buried tree in the landslide, which I have a slab of that tree. I was able to track that down and get that slab. And then this is before they built Bonneville Dam. You can see the rapids. This is what Lewis and Clark called the Great Chute. So this photograph on your left is looking at it from the northeast and looking to the southwest at the Bonneville. Here's the toe of the Bonneville landslide. So here's the drowned forest of the Columbia before the Bonneville Dam raised the water level and drowned these trees. And this is from a little town called Wyeth, and this mountain in the background here is a very characteristic landform. I'm embarrassed I can't remember the name of it now. Wind Mountain. It's actually an igneous intrusion. And so those trees were some of the ones that Don Lawrence sampled. And here's one of his papers. On the left, he was doing some photo documentation of these trees, and then he talks about sampling this particular one. Well, when we were out in the field with him, he told us these trees were all gone. And he was really sad that they were gone. He had some of them stored in the World Forestry exhibit, and that burned down in 1964. So eventually we called the World Forestry Center, and they said, well, we've got this crate in the basement. And this discovery was actually made by Nathan Reynolds, a graduate student who's been working with us. And he said one day, he said, Pat, just what do I need to do to find these? I said, well, you should call the World Forestry Center. So we called him, and sure enough, they had this crate in the basement. So we said, well, let's go look at it. So we went over there, and sure enough, they were 2 of Don Lawrence's slabs of those buried trees. They had actually been lent out to another scientist at Oregon State during the time the World Forestry Center burned down in 1964. And eventually, he did not know that. They eventually found their way back, but he didn't know about it. So this was totally a surprise, and we finally, they said, you mean, the people at the Forestry Institute said, you mean these are the trees Lewis and Clark saw? We said, yes. And they said, well, we don't think you should cut these then. And we said, oh, but please, Don Lawrence would really want us to cut into these trees and take these samples. So finally, they let us do it. They said, well, we'll run the saws. Okay. So we were able to get these really nice samples to do tree ring dating with and radiocarbon dating. And right now, we're just writing it up in a formal paper. We're just trying to get together to write up a formal paper on the radiocarbon date. Still haven't precisely dated it to the year yet, but we're really close. So that's really exciting. And where's my slide about the dam? Oh, well, I had a slide about how much of the river would have been dammed, but I'll save that for another time. Okay, so let's go over to the Tacoma Fault real quickly. Tacoma Fault is just like the Seattle Fault. Here we have a case where a fault actually dams up 2 ponds. These were discovered just a few years ago. And so here is the fault. You can't see it. It's some bedrock sticking up here. This is looking north. And here are these submerged trees. And again, very similar to the date on the Seattle Fault, about 1,100, 1,200 years ago. So I don't have any samples of these trees yet, but I really want to get my hands on these to compare them with the Seattle Fault trees. And this discovery was made by Josh Logan. And so another project that I've had students working on is looking at big landslides that dammed lakes, like the one we first talked about. Here's Glacier Lake in the Cascade Range. Here's the landslide deposit, the debris. You can tell where it came from up here in the mountains. Here's the lake dammed up. Well, the first date we had was on a tree stump with no bark on it that we could see, and it gave us a date of about 660 years before present. So one of my students who wanted to do research said, well, I'd like to work on this project. What could we do? And I said, well, there's a bunch of old trees growing on this landslide. One thing we could do is go see how old they are. Maybe they would tell us, you know, how old the landslide is. At least we could find the minimum age for the landslide. So sure enough, we went up there and we started coring these trees. And we also noticed there was Mount St. Helens ash on the ground from 1479 AD. So between that and looking at the tree rings, we now conclude that this landslide probably happened possibly in the mid-1400s, possibly the same time or near the time of the Great Bonneville landslide that dammed the whole Columbia. So this is something that's we also hope to work on more also, but one thing we really want to do is get back into that lake when the water level is really low and see if we can find stumps with bark on them. Because if you find the bark, then you know you have a context with the day, the year that that tree produced its last ring before it died. So having the bark is really important. So I think I'll show you a couple more slides. Because there's no end to these number of these drowned and buried forests, but probably the coolest thing is that my students got to write this up and publish it at the Northwest Scientific Association meeting, and then they published it at 2 more conferences too, so they were totally excited about this. And it gave the students actually a chance to publish the research, take part in a scientific meeting, and you know, have people come up to them like, this is Colleen, who was coring the tree, and the woman she's talking with is Katie Glue, who's president of the Northwest Scientific Association. So it doesn't get much better than that. You get to go present your results at the meeting and actually have top-notch scientists come up and talk to you about what you did at your poster. So what's the significance of all this? The significance of all this, hopefully, is getting a better record of our past geologic events by using tree rings. So in other words, going outside the science of geology and using another science to try to solve some of these puzzles about when these geologic events happen. Because if we have a better history of these events, then we can know a lot more about what to expect in the future. So I'm going to end my show there and appreciate your attention, and I'll take any questions that you have as well.
Way back there. So thank you, Pat, for coming down. Thank you to the college as well. This is a wonderful spot to hold things. And our IT crew up there has done an amazing job. Have any of you seen this online yet? Obviously not tonight.
I just wondered if you have any information about the trees that are in Clear Lake and the mountains above Eugene.
I didn't talk about Clear Lake Clear Lake and there's a lake in Washington too. I can't remember the name of it now, but it's right just south of Mount St. Helens. So those 2 lakes are dammed by lava flows. And I know that the Clear Lake trees, I've seen the Clear Lake trees, and I kind of remember they died about 2,000 years ago, and they were drowned by, it's the same principle though. A geologic event happens, it plugs up a stream channel and drowns the trees, and then the trees will rot down to the level where the water saturates them. And below that, they're fairly well preserved for a long time because they have very low oxygen there. So those trees record a lava flow, and I don't know exactly what they're from, possibly a cinder cone, because that was a basalt flow of some kind. There are a lot of cinder cones in that part of the Cascade Range. You know, like the bulge, you've heard about the bulge that's happening up west of South Sister. That's on the west flank of South Sister, which is a Mount St. Helens type volcano, but there's also a lot of cinder cones there too, so that could be basalt that's been rising up. Da-na-na-na-na. An inch per year over a 10-mile area.
What systems do you use to calibrate over here to your far right? Sorry.
You know, it's just a voice coming out of the
Voice coming out of the back.
Hi.
Good evening. What systems do you use to calibrate the age of the tree rings? Do you use something like the ancient Bristlecone pine trees that
Oh, I see.
Douglas
In other
used and
words,
things like
what's
that?
the master chronology? Right. Well, around here, one of the problems with the bristlecones is that they're too far away. In microclimates, especially for soil moisture, in other words, narrow rings, big rings, you really have to be in a microclimate very close to where you're at. So the tree rings, the narrow rings, Now, there are some regional years which are very dry all over the place. But most of the tree ring records or chronologies here in the Northwest only go back to the mid 1300s or 1200s. So they don't make 600, 700, 800 years. There are 2 chronologies I know of that go back farther. Dave Yamaguchi, who dated the big Cascadia quake to 1700 AD, he found a bunch of 1,000-year-old trees on Weyerhaeuser land on Long Island, an island along coastal Washington, and Weyerhaeuser was going to cut some of the trees, but they made a deal with the state. They were also going to save a bunch as a huge preserve, which they did. But these trees were on this island, so they were kind of what we call refugium of species protected because they were on this island where there weren't any fires for a long time. So they grew to be very old because probably forest fires is the dominant tree killer, right, over most stands in terms of history, because fires are much more widespread than, say, volcanic eruptions or big landslides. So that record goes back about 1,000 years. And then there's a grad student up at University of British Columbia who went back about 2,200 years from trees he pulled out of a lake called Heel Lake. And so he's got that one chronology, but again, it's only narrow rings, and it's from British Columbia. And so it's really hard to carry those narrow rings all the way down here. So that's why I haven't dated some of these events that are 1,000 years old yet to the year, because I can't. But I'm hoping to get back that far. So, but it's really hard to find trees that are 1,300 years old, and then you have to start daisy chaining these records back in time. But the Bristlecone Pines, grow to be over 5,000 years old, or over 4,000 years old. So, but here's the magic in the bristlecones. When they die, they're at such high elevation that they're actually more or less freeze-dried up there, and they're also very full of pitch, like those white barks I was telling you about. So they're very well preserved, and they're so far apart, they don't get destroyed by forest fires. So the people who are finding the bristlecones, we're finding these isolated old logs that turn out to be, they go back like 10 or 11,000 years of record, even though the oldest one today is only 4,600 or whatever it is. Remember, they cut down the oldest one by accident. And then since then, they found one that's actually older than that one was. So I don't know if I answered your question, but we don't have a good chronology yet, but there are some. And here's where to find them. If you want to find them, go to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, website, where they have all the archival data for climate change, and search for tree ring database. And then you can search for the world's master chronologies by geographic region, by species, by name of the researcher, anything you want to, because it's all there on the NOAA database. In fact, I'm hoping to develop some of these and put them on the NOAA database, because I have a full tree ring lab now at the college. So that's my goal.
Trick you might want to try. I dove in a lake near Pyramid Lake in Nevada, Boulder Lake, 60 feet of water, took a core off a tree in that lake. It's not that hard to do underwater. You might want to get one of your students who likes to dive to go into the areas like that.
I actually wrote a grant to do that last year, and the teacher who was a diver, at the last minute, I hate to say a diver got cold feet, but at the last minute he got cold feet. He realized really that he was overcommitted, and so I am still kind of looking for a diver to do and I have worked with it's a great idea. And see, I don't like to be cold.
So I'd like to thank all of you for participating this evening, and our next talk is on January 18th. There should be 3 more after that, but you can go to www.SWOCC.edu, and as soon as I know, you'll know. So thank you again for coming out tonight. Hopefully we'll see you in January.